I will be reading from 2 Samuel chapter 9, 1 through 13. Then David said, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And David and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." The king said, "Is there not a servant for anyone of the house to Saul? Well, I am Saul to the kindness of God." And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan, who is opposed in Lo-debar." Then the king sent to him and brought him from the house of Machir, and the son of Amiel from Lo-debar. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and protested for himself. And David said, "Mephibosheth," and he said, "Here is your servant." David said to him, "Do not fear, and I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore you to all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat from my table regularly." David said to him, "Do not," and he protested himself again and said, "What is your servant, that you should regard a dead dog like me?" Then the king called to Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that he belongs to Saul and to the house I have given to the master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall cultivate for the land for him, and you shall bring him food who have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat from the table regularly." Now Ziba 15 king according to him that the Lord, and the king upon components and servants. So your servant would do what Mephibosheth ate from David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate of the king in tables regularly. And now he has came lame in both feet.
So most of us are more familiar with the story of David and Jonathan and the friendship that they had and the covenant that they had with each other in protection. But we're going to step way further along and look at the story of David and Mephibosheth, who is we find out is Jonathan's son. And it is this special kindness that David offers as a powerful king, going back on the promise and covenant, showing that kindness and mercy that he once received as well. So in that first verse, David recalls back, takes this initiative of his own to think about restoring some of that kindness back that he remembers from Jonathan. And he looks back and asks, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul?" Not just is anybody left that's descendants of Jonathan, but anybody that is left from the family. And David takes this initiative. No one suggests this course of action. He looks at it and is looking for any relatives that he might find, and continues to go on and wishes to bestow this kindness that he might return to that family. And not knowing that anybody's left, he begins to search out and does this, which part of the interesting thing here is that he does have the kingdom firmly in hand at this time, and asking if anybody's left. Normally, if you were of that family that was of the previous king, you might be very concerned with that, because typically when one king takes over, they take out the family before, as well as Saul had been the sworn enemy of David. He had tried to kill him, and most would be thinking, well, David's after whoever's left with him. But the interesting thing is here he's looking at it in kindness for Jonathan's sake, trying to return that kindness that Jonathan had provided for him, that special friendship that they had had. So as David begins to look at this, he's what he had, Jonathan and David had together. They had a covenant where Jonathan agreed to show kindness to David, but also he asked David to show him the kindness in return, and not only to him, but to all his family. And so as David is remembering this, he begins to take initiative and has that intention to be faithful to that covenant and promise that he made with Jonathan. So as we move on into the second and third, fourth verses here, Jonathan's servant is brought in, a servant of Saul's household named Ziba, and he appears before David and explains to him that, yes, there are still descendants, and he brings to light that Mephibosheth is still alive. He's Jonathan's son. He is crippled, and we find explained later on in 2 Samuel how that had happened. But he is crippled in both feet, and David asks Ziba where he's at, and he explained that he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amel, in Lodebar. What is interesting is that Ziba is the servant of Saul's household. Elsewhere, he is described as the steward of Saul's household. So he would have been the head servant, the person that oversees the day-to-day operations, the wealth, the resources of the family, making sure that everything's being taken care of. And so he would have had great position and some power there at that time. So he wasn't just a regular servant. He was somebody that would have known what was going on, and likewise would have been the natural person to find if there was any heirs left to Saul. So David asked the same question: is there still no one left? And the response that he gives is something that we should note as well, is that David makes the point that he might show God's kindness, returning that kindness that he had received, the blessings that he has received from God, and returning those and passing those along in the kindness. And as he begins to tell and learn about what's going on, we can imagine that David was probably quite overjoyed at this point in time as he's thinking about there's actually Jonathan's son is still alive and is here, that he can bestow this and return that promise and the kindness that Jonathan had provided him. So something that he probably was quite excited about. And earlier on in the first part of Samuel, it discusses how this, a little bit about the history of how Mephibosheth becomes crippled. And it discusses how during that battle, when Saul and Jonathan both die on battle, the nurse that is caring for him ends up dropping him as in a hurried attempt to escape, and so he had been essentially lame since very young. Putting him at that time period would be very disadvantaged for all of his life, and in that society would have been kind of an outcast, which really probably explains why he's not part of the family's household living there under the care of Ziba. Rather, he's away being taken care of by Machir, the son of Amel, in Lodebar, which Lodebar is a town that is east of the Jordan River, and that name actually means nothing. And so Mephibosheth is actually living with a stranger in a town of nothing, and is there with nothing, not being cared for, had not been taken care of, and been offcast. So David calls for so David has him brought from Lodebar, brings him back to Jerusalem, restores him back to where the king had been, and this brings him back. And asks him and brings him in and asks him to come in, and he bows down and is reverent, not knowing what's about to happen, and he's probably in a state of shock as he's taking in, going, why am I here? Bows down and lays himself out, asking and presenting himself as your servant to David. And, so he's wondering, like we discussed, being the last of the heirs, wondering what's going to be happening. Why has he been summoned here? And responding, and David looks to him and says that he needs to fulfill the covenant that he made with his father Jonathan, that show him the kindness and give him the grace and the mercy and bring him back in where he belongs. And probably a little bit skeptical. Methuselah was still wondering what's going on, not understanding why he deserves this grace, knowing what his family had gone after David, and being the grandson of Saul. And so he's wondering what it is, and David reminds him, don't be afraid, for I surely know the kindness that for your sake is from your father, that I'm going to be back to you and restoring. So he begins by restoring the land back that the family had. So as king, yes, Saul would have had rule over the whole kingdom, but he would have had the family, what the family had owned and the possessions of the family. So returning that back to Mephibosheth, so that he has those that land and those the means and the ability to take care of himself, and bringing those and setting those back. So David tells him that this covenant of kindness first is going to be brought to you in this. I'm bringing you back the lands as well, but also I'm going to ask that you eat with me every day. Be with me at the king's table. So he's providing him back that a place where he has a location to be and a place of honor, as well as returning that land and the gifts that he has to provide him financial security and food and continued ability to sustain himself throughout that. And when he's telling him that he's bringing him back, that you can always dine at my table, and is a great act of kindness and generosity and humility, both for David and for Mephibosheth, both in that David is humbling himself to bring him to his table, as well as Mephibosheth finding the grace and humility to be able to take part in that and be dining at the king's table every day, especially as being a lamed and crippled, would normally be somebody that would have been banned from those type of opportunities to do that. If we think about it in today's sense, it would be like if we, as just ourselves, being invited to go eat at go to a large dinner at the White House or at the governor's mansions or with celebrities, a similar type of event, but not just once. This is being provided to him for every day. And David, probably for him, this is something that he's returning, something that he was offered as well, being able to be brought in and coming from humble origins and being able to be allowed and brought up in at the king's table. So one of the things that David continues to bring up, that brought up in here a couple times, is God's kindness. And back in chapter 7, David, when he first becomes king, is discussing, who am I, Lord? Where is my family that you've brought me here? Understanding the humility and the grace that God has brought to him for the blessings that have allowed him to be in this place. And David continues at this point in not overlooking the fact that this kindness, these blessings, the opportunities he's gotten has all been through being faithful to God and through the power that God has been able to grant him these opportunities. And as a good and gracious man, David knew that what had happened to Mephibosheth was at no fault of his own. Him becoming crippled, him losing his position as, you know, being the next and potentially in line for the kingdom to be the king, and none of this was anything to him losing it or gaining it had not been at his fault, and so providing that kindness to him too, and Mephibosheth provides that humility in return, you know, ungraciously not knowing why he's been doing this and describing him as a servant and as himself as a servant, and even really downplaying himself as the dead dog, and why somebody like me should this even come to me. And he's just blown away by the kindness that is provided this. And then David continues in his response to him of going, beginning with taking the Ziba, the head servant, and having him become now him and his household becoming full servants to Mephibosheth, and that they are to work the land and provide, bringing in the crops and getting those stored up and taking care of his resources for him, and tells them that whatever is commanded of him from Mephibosheth to begin to follow him and act upon those words or those commands. And from that point on, Mephibosheth eats at David's table just like one of the king's sons, described in verse 12. And so he dines at the table, and what used to be the head servant of would have been his father and grandfather's household is now serving him, bringing in the crops, working the fields, and he is also blessed with a son named Micah, and continues to dine at the Lord's table. So he, in David's kindness, returning that from Jonathan, providing those possessions back to his grandson, or to Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson, providing those resources that he can take him, but also bringing him into his household as a son, allowing him to eat at his table, just like he would have been part of the royal family. And doesn't seem like a whole lot as you're going, as we think about it in simple terms, I mean, David's just returning what he did, but it's a great lesson in the humility, the grace, the kindness, and also the knowledge and acknowledgement of the blessings and kindness of those coming from God. So part of that would be in that, you know, we sow what we reap, or we reap what we are sowing. Sorry. So as David and Jonathan both presented kindness to each other, Jonathan's kindness to David was later on returned to his son. Likewise, as we provide stewardship and kindness to others, it might not be something that we directly receive in return as kindness from others, but it can be passed on to others, that you provide some aid or some help to somebody, that showing that kindness to them, and that sparks that desire for them to do something to the next person, and as that can grow. So that lesson of sowing and reaping. Also, in the faithfulness, David maintained that faithfulness to God, giving him those blessings, but also he was faithful and true to the promise that he made to Jonathan, that he would, when he is able and can, providing that, returning that kindness to his family. And so he made sure that he was keeping that word and taking care of him. Even though Jonathan had already passed away, he was still maintaining that promise that he had provided, as well as being a good steward. He was being a steward of his power and realizing that these acts of kindness that he is providing is really kindness that he is being able to return from God. And he makes that known several times, that this allow me to provide the kindness, return God's kindness to those, is likewise as we are provided those opportunities here in the States. We're provided, in comparison to other parts of the world, a large amount of opportunities, wealth, different gifts that we can steward to further provide for others. Also mercy. David didn't have to provide mercy and continue on to Saul's household. They had attempted to kill him, and he'd been on the run, but he continues to provide that kindness and mercy. In reflection, God has provided us as that kindness and mercy in our blessings, and as we try to do that as well and to pass that along. Both David and Mephibosheth show a good lesson of humility. Mephibosheth not feeling that he is deserving and needing to be returned of these acts of kindness and not knowing why he deserves it. But also David, his humility of realizing that his ability to provide this kindness and his opportunities had come through God, and not boasting that these were actions for his sake. And overall, it provides a kind of a parallel of how Methuselah was provided a new life through grace and mercy, and a new seat and a new life there with David. Likewise, as Christians, we are provided a new life, we becoming brothers and sisters in Christ. God, through all of this, we are provided a new place. Just a great example of humility, acts of kindness and love, not taking vengeance, taking time to acknowledge those and provide those blessings, and something that we should strive to do, and reaching out and maintaining that. So if there are any of you, those that today need the prayers or have concerns or would like to come forward, as we prepare to sing the song of encouragement, I invite you to do that.